I'm Charlotta Hamilton. Welcome to Lesson 1. We're going to be working with markers today, creating a portrait using cross-hatching and contouring with different colors that maybe you wouldn't use in your everyday art practice. So let's begin. I just want to show you a couple of my sample portraits that I've done in marker and the different types of markers that I've used doing these portraits. So for example, this one right in front of me, I did this one in my Faber-Castell artist pens. They're excellent for fine lines and they're a pretty regular line. I've got a little piece of paper here so I can show you a little bit how the tip is. The tip, actually I'll use a different color for the camera. The tip is shaped like a brush pen, but it's a lot smaller. So you can still get your very fine lines for cross-hatching, which is great. And then if you push a little harder, you can get a varied line as well. They also come in many, many different colors, which I really love. So let me just put Faber-Castell here. This way you'll know which ones are which. I also used a fine tip pen for this, but we won't be using any black fine tip pens for today's class. But you can combine them with many different pens as well, and they look great. The next portrait that I did was this one of Deborah, and I just used Crayola markers for this one. So Crayola markers are actually one of my favorites, only because they are quite economical and they're usually dotted around my house because my kids have them in all their pencil cases. I find they do run out a lot quicker than other markers, but I also like them because they're water soluble, and I'll show you that in a little minute. So they don't have, I find, the preciseness of the Faber-Castell or the fineness, and they do wear down a lot more, and you don't get as varied line with the Crayola markers, but I love that they come in so many different colors. Another favorite of mine are the Staedtler markers. I always have to check how to spell Staedtler. And these don't come in as many colors as Crayola or the Faber-Castell, but they are very, very consistent in the shape and size of their markings. You don't get really a fine tip marking, but they are consistent and they have a nice feel on the paper. So I've used these a lot too with my portraits that I do. Another one is the classic Sharpie. Now these are great for a permanent line. You're not going to get any bleed with these at all. But you have to remember, they do not come off anything. Another one which are fun to use, which I also took out of my kids' pencil cases, are the Mr. Sketch. And these are scented, but you can create some really fun markings with these. Not so much a fine line. Probably great for typography. And last but not least, I have some Tombow markers, Tombow brush pens. And I love the shape and the line of these. These are great. And there we go. Now I'm going to do a little bit of an experiment so you can see which ones are water soluble and which ones are not water soluble. So the Faber-Castell, they don't have too much water solubility at all. So we'll put, let's just use it, no. Water. Sorry, I should have written that a little bit smaller. Water. So when we add water to it, the Crayola markers, they do have a lot of water solubility. So I will put a yes here. The Staedtler markers, they do as well. The Sharpie does not have any. I still have a little bit from here. So the Sharpie is a definite no. The Mr. Sketch does. Oh, that's not my Mr. Sketch. That was a fluorescent marker, yes. And the Tombow marker, let's check this one. Oh, that's amazing. So that means the pigment in this is really, really very strong. Okay, so that's a yes as well. So this is a good way to check what your materials can do in your studio. So you may not have thought to put water with a marker, but you can create really great effects when you're working on a portrait. So not that I've used any effects on these ones that I have used, but I'll show you with the one that I'm going to do today how you can use it. This is also another Crayola portrait that I've done. So you can see the difference in intensity. This one is a lot softer and this one is a lot more contrasting. So let's get started. Today we're going to be using a Muse, which I have used before, and I love all her pictures that she posts on her profile. I'm using the app Sketchy. If you don't know how, or if you've never used it before, it's very simple. You just go to your home page, you go to up here with the saved images, and then I would pick Meryl because I've saved her before. Go into her inspiration pictures, and then I'll find that picture that I've saved in her profile. So here we go. And I've picked this portrait or this picture of her to do a portrait because there's high contrast. So you've got the really dark hair, and then her hair and her skin, sorry, when you look at her skin, it's extremely light in many areas, but then she has a lot of tonal differences. So I always look at a portrait and I look at the values, and the values to me are the different varieties of one shade. So because we're looking at a black and white portrait, I can see that the hair would probably be a number 5, and the brightest area would be right here on her nose, and that would be a number 1. So in between the 5 and 1, we have all the different tones, whether it's in her sweater, underneath her neck, just on her cheek, that may be, or the other part of her skin would be a number 2, and then just right here would be a number 3. And then underneath here is probably a 4, and then you've got the darks, which are number 5. And if you squint and look at a picture, you'll be able to see those tonal differences. So let's start. I'm just going to put Meryl right here so you can see her as well. I'm going to zoom in slightly. And today, because I want a water-soluble marker, let's just use Crayola markers for today's portrait. So I'm going to start with a lighter color, which for some orange wouldn't be a lighter color, but for me it is. And I'm going to just put a mark where I want the top of her head and a mark where her chin is down here. And this way you can proportion your portrait however size paper you have. Whether you want to make a portrait this small, you would put a mark right here and right here, and then you'd proportion everything in within those two marks. So I've got my marks, and I'm going to see approximately her eyes are in the middle, so I'll just make 2 points here. And then her nose comes a little bit lower than halfway here to her chin. And then her mouth is here. And I'm not going to put a mark all the way through the middle. I'm going to imagine where her nose is. So let's just make a little mark here where her first eyebrow is. And then a little mark here where her other eyebrow is. And the top of her head is right here. We may need to extend that a little afterwards because her hair needs to go on top of her head. So let's start with her eyebrows. I usually start just by mapping out all the different values that I see. So the lights and the darks on her face, I'm going to map out so that I can fill those in with the different gradients and different colors that I want to use. Just looking at the basic shapes and the shapes of what the shadows make, not necessarily each individual feature. So right here she has a shadow there, and then she's got her hair that comes down just past this shadow. So I'm always relating where the next part of the drawing I'm drawing is to the previous part that I just drew. So you can see I went a little bit over that line, but I have it as a guideline so I don't misproportion a lot of the portrait. So there's her nose. She has a shadow that comes down here and one at the top of her nose, or rather the tip of her nose, and then a little bit darker area here. Then she has a little shadow that comes underneath her nose and connects with her mouth. And then her lips dip down here. And then I look at this angle. So I know that the side of her nose is right here. And I know that her mouth is further away from her nose. So I'm going to put a little mark here and try and get that line of her lip. I'm also looking at angles. I relate the angles to either a horizontal or a vertical. So I know that her mouth is pretty much on a horizontal and it isn't above it or lower than it. And she has a shadow right underneath her lip, her bottom lip. And that kind of comes out like this. And then her chin is right here. So we were pretty close with the bottom line. Then I know that there's a little bit of an angle coming out from this nose area, out from the nostril, and then coming up on her cheek. Now I want to be really careful to leave this area very bright, because when you squint your eyes, this tone and this tone is very similar. It's a little bit brighter on this side, but not much. So let's try and leave this area and this shape completely free from any color right now. And then trying to get those shapes. Okay, her sweater comes, we can put that in as well. Comes just above her nose, around here. Comes down You don't really see her neck area at all, but you just see the shape of her sweater. You know her neck is there, but we're not going to draw it in if we don't see it. Now, I'm looking at her nose and I think I've gone a little bit wide on this side. So I'm just going to correct it slightly because her eyebrows come quite close together. This one comes up a little bit more. I want to make sure that I get that angle and that this one doesn't have as much of an angle. Okay. She has her parting to her hair here. When I'm doing a portrait, I do focus on certain areas at certain times, but you kind of have to look at the whole portrait as well before you start doing any details. So I would never just work on an eye and then work on the nose and then work on... I want to get the whole sketch first and then we'll add color to it. So this is usually how I go about drawing a portrait. And sometimes I'll give myself a time frame to create the portrait, almost like a test. And you want to do this sometimes as an exercise just to train your eyes to see quicker, which is great for if you're sketching outside or at a bar or at a coffee shop. People don't wait around for you to sketch them. You have to capture them really quickly. But we're fortunate with an app like Sketchy that you can find so many muses to draw. Okay, I do feel like this eye is a little bit further down, so I'm going to bring that up slightly. Bring this one down, bring this one up. Okay. And her cheekbone comes in slightly and then around. Okay. Maybe this can be a little bit narrower. And then just under here is the other side of her hair. I think she must have a braid in her hair. But you can't see any detail, so we're not going to put any detail. And then the sweater wraps around her neck like this. And then under here. Okay, and I can't see too much of her shoulders, but that's okay. That's enough for me to be happy to draw. I think I went a little bit wide on her hair on this side. Okay, so now we have the rough mapping of her face. I want to go over with you and look at the shadows. So right here, there's a really dark shadow in here. So I'm going to just mark it in. And I call this color mapping because I'm actually almost drawing paths on her skin to help me when I go to color her. This way I don't touch the lights on her face, just like I told you about this area, and your drawings will stay fresh and clean because you can't erase marker. And some of you may feel a little intimidated by just sketching in marker, but don't, just try it. You can go with a really light color. If you went with a yellow, then you could go over, but I just wanted to make sure that you could see this with the camera. But sometimes I will sketch it with a yellow or sketch it with like a peachy color, and then I'll go over with a bright color. Okay, so squinting my eyes, I see there's a little bit more shadow right here and a little bit of a shadow on this side. And then also in between her nose, right here, there's a little shadow. Okay. Got that. We've got her mouth, her lips, just slightly like that. And I think we're ready to add some color. So I'm going to go a little lighter first, and I'm going to choose a pink. I'm just going to make sure that it works. I'm going to choose a pink for all the lighter tones on the portrait of Meryl. And I'm going in the direction and the form of her face and the contours. I'm not going to fill in here, but right here on her lip it's lighter, and a little bit under here. Now I'll just take this piece of paper again. If you draw a line with a marker that's extremely close together, but in the same color, it can look denser and darker. Whereas if you draw a line which is separate but in the same color and leave space in between, it'll give a lighter shade. So you can also do a variant of hatching too. You can go closer and you can hatch over and then over again, and you'll create a darker area. Or you can leave it very light like this. So with this tone, I'm going to leave it very light because I don't want those areas to be dark. I just want to give some color. And in between here. I'm also going to just add the same color to her eyeball, because if you squint your eyes, her nose is still brighter than her eyeball, and I think that's a lot of people make that mistake and draw the eyeball completely white, and it's not. Okay, and then a little bit of color right here. And then we still have room, and we're going to keep these areas of her skin nice and bright and light. Maybe a little bit down here she needs. Okay, so now I want a color which is in between. I'm going to use the purple, which I showed you before. And these are going to go, this color is going to go right in here. This is the mid-tone. The mid-tone of all her gradients in the color mapping that we're doing. I'm just going to go over the darker areas too. And then use the dark to go over that color as well, because we can put some more detail in with the dark after this one. So as you can see, we're slowly building up form and shape. It may look a little strange right now, but it'll soon all come together. And like I said before, experiment with colors. Don't be afraid of them. Especially if you're not working on a commission. This is the time when you can experiment. So I keep going around the portrait and just keep looking for areas which are a little bit darker. Okay, I think I'm ready to go in. Let's put a little bit actually first with the sweater. And let's do the sweater in orange. I think it'll have a nice contrast to the blues and purples that we're going to use in the face. So this sweater, the color has already lines mapped out for you, which the knitting makes. So we're going to follow those, which makes it easier. You have to be careful with these Crayola markers, because even though they're great and they're water soluble, they also do smear. So just watch the side of your hand on those. This is really light, so I'm going to make those marks a little bit bigger. Okay, so going back to the portrait, I think I'm going to do blue hair. I just want to test my pen. So right up here where her hairline is, we want to keep that soft. So I'm just going to go in and try and do some individual marks, but the rest is pretty much, we're able to fill it in. And right here she has some wispy areas. Comes down. This one is actually a very dark blue, so we'll get a very high contrast with this one. So I'm going to just fill in. If I can't see any details, this is how I'm going to approach the hair. You still want to go in the direction that the hair is. Just because you're filling in, still try and go in the same direction. And here too, let's make this a little bit lighter as it comes in. To her parting line. And I think actually goes up slightly further, her hairline, the top of her head. There, and then she has these wispies, so you can almost, like you're not touching the page, you can create a little bit of movement in the portrait by putting these wispies that look like they've been blown by the wind a little bit. Okay, so this is where the fun comes in, because this is where the portrait comes together. The details. And because we have all these lines underneath, I'm still looking at the portrait, but we have a guideline. But But this is where you can be a little bit more precise in line shape and direction, and make sure that the angles are right, because this all amounts to Meryl Kay looking like Meryl Kay. She doesn't have any light in this eye, so I'm not going to draw it. And this side is really dark, so I'm going to add a little bit more dark, the blue here, just to create a little bit more shadow. And I'm going to clean up this line slightly and bring it down here under her chin. And put the shadow right under here of her sweater and her neck. And change the direction slightly under there. Okay, let's do the other eye. She has a few feathery eyebrows there. It comes across. It starts in this direction. Okay. Now in this eye there is a fleck of light, so I want to keep an area where I can have the brightest white there. Just want to dot a few little dots there to make the eye imagine that there is some little lashes. I don't want to do individual ones. And then a little bit more shadow right here because it's very dark. And then underneath her nose, she has a very little line here of shadow, and then where her nostrils are, you can't really see the nostrils, it's just the line shape. Just going to make this a little bit darker on this side. And underneath her nose, in her mouth. And just underneath her lip, which kind of goes up a little bit, that needs to be darker. And down by her chin. I'm not too happy with this side of her face, so I'm going to bring it in slightly and create a little bit less of an angle right there. And get some wispies here of her hair. And I don't want to create, I think I'm going to use a different color for the shadow on her sweater. So let's go in with a raspberry tone. To create the shadows. They're not that different in color, or in tone rather, because we're drawing from a black and white. Just wanted a little bit of contrast. And I think that's it. Put a little bit of the same color in. And I find that helps just bring the bottom colors and the top together. So that's Meryl Kay. Before you go, I just want to quickly show you, like I said I was going to, and take a little bit of water and just maybe soften some of the harshness of some of the lines, but not all of them. So I just want to show you how adding a little bit of water to water-soluble markers can change your portrait. So for example, on this side of her nose, I could take a little bit of water and just soften some of the colors. I'm not going to do it to all of them, maybe just underneath her nose here. And then on top of her lip. I'm trying to be really careful not to blend the water on the darker colors, just on the lighter ones. And there you go. You don't have to do the whole portrait, but just adding a little bit of water to some of your lines can create a different effect. And that concludes lesson 1. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in my other classes.